The shattered morning. In the quiet town of Harrison, Arkansas, it was a beautiful sunlit morning, the kind that filled the heart with warmth and promise. The skies stretched clear and blue above, with only a few cotton-like clouds drifting lazily across. Birds chirped in the trees, and a gentle breeze brought the scent of wildflowers that grew along the sidewalks. Life in Harrison moved at a slower pace, and that's exactly why Jane and her husband David had chosen to settle there. It was a place of solace, a haven where neighbors knew each other by name and strangers were rarely seen. Jane, 8 months pregnant and glowing, stepped out of her quaint, white-bricked home with a smile. The life she carried within her brought a constant feeling of warmth and joy, radiating from her with a quiet strength that those who passed by could feel. Today, she had a small errand to run, just a trip to the local grocery store for ingredients to prepare David's favorite meal. He'd been away for a few days on a business trip, and tonight, Jane wanted to surprise him. She imagined the way his face would light up when he walked in the door to the smell of his favorite meal, and the thought made her smile. As she walked, she spoke softly to the baby growing inside her. "You're going to love meeting your daddy, little one," she whispered, feeling a gentle kick in response. "And tonight, we're going to make him very happy." Jane's life was filled with small but precious moments like these. Her gentle spirit, kindness, and calm demeanor were qualities that endeared her to the residents of Harrison. The townspeople, in turn, adored her, and they frequently stopped to chat or offer a wave. It was a well-knit community, and Jane had lived here for years, building a life filled with love, respect, and above all, a deep sense of belonging. Her pace was slower these days, the weight of her pregnancy making her mindful of every step. Yet with each gentle stride, Jane felt connected to the world around her. The rustling leaves, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her shoes, and the distant laughter of children playing in the park, it was as if everything was perfectly aligned. She was grateful for these little pockets of peace, for the life she and David had built in this town, and for the small life growing within her. But this morning, fate had other plans. Just as she was savoring the calmness of the day, a sudden, jarring sound shattered the tranquility. The screech of tires against pavement came out of nowhere, making her stop in her tracks. A black and white police car abruptly pulled up beside her, its lights flashing without sound, casting ominous red and blue shadows on the pavement. Startled, Jane turned to see Officer Kyle sitting in the driver's seat, his jaw set in a hard line. He was a recent addition to the Harrison Police Department, a man whose presence had already stirred unease among the town's residents. Unlike the other officers, who were familiar and friendly, Kyle was known for his cold, distant demeanor. His arrival in Harrison had marked a shift in the town's atmosphere, introducing an undercurrent of tension that many couldn't quite put a finger on. Kyle had his window down, and as he glanced at Jane, his eyes held a look she recognized all too well, a look that saw her as something other, something foreign, even in her own community. His gaze was sharp, predatory, filled with a suspicion that was both unwarranted and deeply unsettling. Jane felt her pulse quicken, her hand instinctively resting on her belly as a protective gesture. "Stop right there," Kyle commanded, his voice slicing through the air with an authority that brooked no argument. He stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his utility belt, fingers dangerously close to his baton. Jane's heart pounded. She had no idea why he would single her out like this. She was just a pregnant woman walking down the street, a regular person in a quiet town where nothing ever happened. Swallowing her fear, she managed to speak, her voice soft yet steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but cautious. Kyle's eyes narrowed, his lips curling in a small, contemptuous smirk. "Problem? I'd say walking around looking suspicious is enough of a problem, don't you think?" He took a step closer, his posture rigid, and Jane could feel the hostility emanating from him, seeping into the air between them. "I'm just on my way to the store," she explained, her voice carefully neutral. "I live just down the street." She gestured vaguely in the direction of her home, hoping it might remind him that she was, In fact, a local, not some stranger deserving of suspicion. But Kyle didn't seem interested in explanations. "I've seen you around here before," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And if you ask me, there's something not quite right about the way you act." Jane felt a surge of indignation rise within her, but she fought to keep her composure. "I've lived here for years, officer," she replied calmly, though her voice held a note of quiet defiance. "Everyone in this town knows me." Kyle's expression hardened, and he took another step closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "Well, I don't know you," he retorted, his voice growing sharper. "And I don't like strangers who look like they're up to no good." A wave of cold realization washed over Jane. She understood what he was implying, the unspoken accusation laced within his words. It was something she had experienced before, but here, in her own town, in the place she called home, it cut deeper. Her breath caught, and she instinctively took a small step back, feeling her stomach tighten with anxiety. Her hand moved protectively over her belly once more, a silent gesture of defense for the life she was nurturing within her. "Please," she said, her voice steady yet edged with a trace of desperation. "I'm just going to the store. I haven't done anything wrong." But Kyle wasn't listening. He took another step forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab her arm. Jane's eyes widened, and she stumbled back, her balance precarious with the added weight of her pregnancy. The world around her felt as if it was tilting, the familiar comfort of her surroundings slipping away as fear took hold. "Don't you dare walk away from me," Kyle shouted, his voice laced with venom. In a single, swift motion, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. Jane gasped, her free hand instinctively moving to shield her stomach. The pain was sharp, slicing through her arm and sending a shockwave of fear and anger coursing through her body. She struggled to pull away, her voice choked with desperation. "Let go of me, please." But Kyle's expression was unyielding, his grip tightening as he pulled her closer. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he sneered, his voice filled with a twisted sense of authority. "You're nothing but trouble." In that moment, a fire ignited within Jane, a fierce determination to protect herself and her unborn child. She mustered all the strength she had, yanking her arm freed from his grasp, and stumbling back, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "I'm going to report you," she managed to say, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't right." Kyle merely laughed, a dark, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. "Go ahead," he said with a sneer. "See if anyone cares." Jane turned and walked away as quickly as she could, her heart pounding as tears blurred her vision. She didn't look back, even as she felt his gaze burning into her back, a silent reminder of the hostility she had just faced. As she reached the corner, her resolve hardened. She knew she couldn't stay silent. Not for herself, and certainly not for her child. This was her town, her home, and she wouldn't let fear drive her away. And though she couldn't know it yet, this incident would set off a chain of events that would shake Harrison to its core, a ripple of justice that would finally bring Officer Kyle face to face with the reckoning he deserved. The return of a protector. As Jane made her way back home, her heart ached with a cocktail of emotions: anger, fear, and frustration. Each step felt heavier than the last, and though she tried to keep herself composed, her mind raced with what had just happened. The peaceful town of Harrison, which had always felt like a safe harbor, suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. The encounter with Officer Kyle, his callous disregard for her safety, and his blatant aggression left her shaken to the core. She clutched her stomach protectively, feeling the life within her kick in response to her tension. Upon reaching her front door, Jane leaned against it for a moment, gathering herself before stepping inside. She needed to calm down, to keep her emotions in check, for the sake of her baby. She had been waiting for David's return all week, but now she felt desperate for his presence, his strength. David, her rock, her protector, was always there to reassure her and make her feel safe. Now, more than ever, she needed him by her side. Jane took a few deep breaths, brushing away the tear that threatened to fall. She went about the house with trembling hands, attempting to prepare for his return as planned. But each clink of a pot and each motion in the kitchen felt foreign, her mind drifting back to the events on the street. She hadn't told anyone about the encounter, not even her friends in the neighborhood. Somehow, though, she knew she wouldn't have to. The town had a way of knowing things quickly. Hours later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jane heard the familiar hum of her husband's car pulling up in the driveway. Relief washed over her, and she hurried to the door. She opened it just as David stepped out of the car, his tall frame outlined by the fading light. His face, weary from travel, softened instantly when he saw her standing there, her eyes bright with emotion. "Jane," he said warmly, closing the distance between them. He wrapped his arms around her, his strong embrace like a balm to her raw nerves. She held onto him tightly, allowing herself to sink into his warmth and comfort. David could sense something was off. He gently pulled back, studying her face with a concerned expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face, searching for answers. Jane hesitated, her mind racing with how to explain what had happened. She didn't want to worry him, but the memory of Kyle's hostility made her realize she couldn't hide it. "There was an incident," she began, her voice low, struggling to find the right words. She explained, as best as she could, the events of that morning. David's expression shifted from concern to a slow, simmering anger as she recounted the details, the fear she felt, the aggression Kyle had shown, and how he had grabbed her without provocation. By the time she finished, David's jaw was set, his eyes flashing with a look she hadn't seen in a long time. David had a past that he rarely talked about. Before they moved to Harrison, he had worked as an operative for the CIA. He had experienced and seen things that had changed him, things he had hoped to leave behind when they settled in this peaceful town. The serene, family-oriented life they had built in Harrison was supposed to be a fresh start, a life far removed from the shadows he had once inhabited. But hearing what Jane had been through sparked a familiar resolve within him, a fierce need to protect his family that he could no longer ignore. David gently took her hand, leading her to the couch. He sat beside her, his gaze intense yet steady, as he placed a reassuring hand on her belly. "I'm here now," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "No one is going to harm you or our child. I'll make sure of that." Jane knew he meant every word. She trusted David implicitly, but she also knew he wasn't a man to make empty promises. His background, his training, and his instincts were all part of him, even if he rarely let that side show. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a glimmer of hope that he could find a way to right the wrong that had been done to her. David spent the evening with her, keeping things light and comforting. But underneath the surface, his mind was a whirlwind of strategies and thoughts. He knew that confronting a police officer directly could be complicated. However, he wasn't one to let obstacles deter him when it came to protecting his loved ones. The next morning, as the first light crept through their bedroom window, David was already awake, his mind focused and clear. He kissed Jane's forehead gently, careful not to wake her, then slipped out of bed. He made his way to his small office at the back of the house, a room that Jane referred to as his sanctuary. It was where he stored remnants of his past life, a locked drawer filled with documents, a collection of small gadgets he had once used in the field, and his laptop. Booting up his computer, David began researching Officer Kyle, digging through any publicly accessible information he could find. Kyle wasn't hard to trace. He had a history that went beyond Harrison. David discovered several reports from previous towns where Kyle had worked. Complaints of misconduct, accusations of racial profiling, and rumors of physical aggression littered his record. But each time, Kyle had managed to dodge consequences, often transferred quietly to another department rather than held accountable for his actions. The pattern was disturbing but not surprising. David's past experiences had shown him how corruption and protectionism could shelter people like Kyle within law enforcement. Armed with this information, David knew he needed to do more than simply report the incident. He had to make it impossible for Kyle to escape this time, to ensure that Harrison would be the place where he faced the repercussions he had evaded for so long. It was time to pull some strings, to use connections he hadn't tapped into since he left the CIA. Later that morning, David placed a call to an old contact, a former colleague who had moved into a position of influence within state law enforcement. They hadn't spoken in years, and David knew his friend would be surprised to hear from him. But as he explained the situation, his friend listened carefully, his tone serious. "David, you know the risks of getting involved in this kind of situation," his friend cautioned, his voice measured, "especially with your background. If this officer senses any retaliation coming from you, he might retaliate against Jane." David's grip tightened on the phone. "That's why I'm not going to handle it directly," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to dig deeper, to gather whatever you can on him, and ensure the proper channels are aware of his history. I want this to be done right, above board, so he doesn't slip through the cracks again." There was a pause on the other end of the line before his friend spoke again. "All right, David. I'll see what I can do. But be careful. If Kyle's as aggressive as you say, he might not take well to anyone meddling in his affairs." David thanked his friend and ended the call, feeling a sense of relief mixed with tension. He had set the wheels in motion, but he knew this was only the beginning. He had to remain vigilant, to protect Jane and their unborn child from any potential fallout. That afternoon, David walked with Jane to the local park, hoping to ease her mind. He kept his arm around her, every sense attuned to their surroundings. He noticed the neighbors glancing at them, whispers carrying in the breeze. The encounter with Kyle had already made its way through the town, and David could feel the unease in the air. People respected him and Jane, and the community's unspoken support was a comfort. But he knew that in matters like these, silent approval wouldn't be enough to stop someone like Kyle. They sat on a bench, watching the children play on the swings and listening to the distant chirping of birds. The park had always been a place of peace, a space where they had dreamed of bringing their child one day. David took Jane's hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to get through this," he assured her, his voice filled with unwavering confidence. "And when our child arrives, this place will feel safe again. I promise." But even as he spoke those words, David knew that his promise would require vigilance, resilience, and possibly a reckoning that went beyond what he had ever anticipated. Because Kyle wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a threat to everything they held dear, and David was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his family, even if it meant drawing on a part of himself he had long left behind. Shadows of the past and a community's call for justice. Days passed, but the tension that had settled over the quiet town of Harrison didn't ease. Word of Jane's encounter with Officer Kyle had spread swiftly. Whispers followed her wherever she went, neighbors murmuring in hushed tones about the incident that had rocked their peaceful community. Though Jane had tried to keep the incident low-key, the people in town felt the impact of what had happened. Harrison was a close-knit town, and Jane's warmth and generosity were well known. The thought that someone as beloved as her could be treated with such disrespect and aggression in her own neighborhood was enough to stir the indignation of everyone who heard the story. Meanwhile, David worked discreetly from behind the scenes. Since contacting his former colleague, he had kept a close eye on Kyle's movements and actions, watching and waiting for the right moment. The more David learned, the clearer it became that Kyle wasn't just another officer with a tough demeanor. His history of violence, bigotry, and unchecked aggression was well documented yet buried under a pattern of transfers and conveniently dismissed complaints. David understood that bringing someone like Kyle to justice would require more than just a single complaint. It would need indisputable evidence and an unwavering resolve. One afternoon, while Jane was resting, David took his truck to a nearby town where he could speak with some of Kyle's former colleagues. He drove with a purpose, his mind clear and his senses honed. Harrison had become his sanctuary. But now he had to go back to the life he once led, a life that required careful planning and quiet determination. Upon arriving at the neighboring police precinct, David introduced himself as a concerned local from Harrison. He explained his interest in Officer Kyle's past, subtly hinting that he was considering filing an official complaint. Though the officers were initially guarded, David's respectful demeanor and careful approach soon had them loosening up, sharing stories that painted a picture of Kyle's behavior. Several officers recalled incidents of unnecessary force, unjustified arrests, and even some instances of racially motivated hostility. But as David listened, he noticed a common theme: fear. Kyle, it seemed, had a way of instilling fear not only in the civilians he was sworn to protect, but also in his own colleagues. The officers described him as manipulative, someone who knew how to operate just under the radar, avoiding accountability while pushing others around. There was a strange, unspoken agreement in each of their voices. None of them had dared to challenge him, and it was clear that Kyle thrived on that power. David left the precinct with a heavy heart. The visit confirmed his suspicions, but also deepened his resolve. He was determined to ensure Kyle faced the consequences he had long evaded, not just for Jane's sake, but for the sake of every vulnerable person in Harrison. The town deserved a police force it could trust, not one that allowed officers like Kyle to abuse their power. Back in Harrison, Jane was beginning to notice the impact of her story on the community. Friends, neighbors, and even local shopkeepers started reaching out to her, offering quiet words of support and solidarity. Some people told her that they, too, had felt uncomfortable in Kyle's presence, though they'd never spoken up before. A few shared their own stories of feeling intimidated by him, recounting how he would stop and question them without reason, his behavior cold and hostile. Jane listened, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger that others in her community had experienced the same fear she had. As word spread, a group of townsfolk began to discuss the possibility of addressing the issue directly with the police department. They held an informal meeting at a local community center, where people shared their concerns openly for the first time. Jane, still shaken by the experience but encouraged by the support, decided to attend. At the community center, the room was filled with familiar faces, friends, and neighbors who had come to show their support. The air buzzed with quiet tension as people settled into their seats, their expressions somber yet determined. David stood by Jane's side, his presence a reassuring force. Though he hadn't planned to speak, he knew that this meeting was crucial, not only for Jane's sake, but for the entire town. An older man named Mr. Hensley, who had lived in Harrison for decades, stood up to address the crowd. "We've seen a lot of things in this town, but we've never had to deal with an officer who makes us feel unsafe. I think it's time we demand some answers," he said, his voice steady and calm. Others nodded in agreement, and one by one, people began sharing their experiences with Kyle. A young woman recounted how he had stopped her while she was walking home late one night, questioning her for no apparent reason. Another elderly resident described how Kyle had looked at him with suspicion as he sat on his porch one evening, merely enjoying the night air. As the stories continued, the atmosphere grew more charged. Jane felt a mixture of relief and anger, relief that she wasn't alone, and anger that so many had suffered in silence. When it was her turn, she stood up, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice clear. "I've lived here for years," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "I know all of you, and you know me. I've always felt safe in this town, like I was part of a family. But that day, when Officer Kyle stopped me, I felt like a stranger, like I didn't belong." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It's not just about me or my family. It's about what kind of community we want to live in. A community where we protect each other, not where we live in fear." David felt a surge of pride as he listened to Jane's words. Her courage in the face of adversity reminded him of the strength that had always drawn him to her. When she sat down, he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The meeting concluded with the decision to draft a formal complaint to the police department. The community agreed that they would stand together, their collected voice too loud to ignore. It was a powerful show of unity, and Jane felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would change. Later that evening, as David and Jane walked back to their home, he felt a shift within him. Harrison was more than just a town now. It was a place he would defend with every fiber of his being. David had always been protective of Jane, but now he felt a responsibility to protect the entire community, to stand as a shield against anyone who threatened their peace. As they reached their home, David could see the flicker of unease in Jane's eyes. Though she had been strong for the community, the fear of retaliation weighed heavily on her mind. Sensing her concern, David placed his hands on her shoulders, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Jane, I want you to know something," he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "I'm here. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or our family. I have a plan. We're going to make sure Kyle can't hurt anyone else in this town." Jane looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and worry. "David, I trust you. I don't want anything to happen to you either. I know what you're capable of, but I don't want you putting yourself in danger for me." David's face softened, and he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "This isn't just for you," he replied gently. "It's for everyone in this town. And I'm not alone in this. We have the community's support now. They believe in us, and they're standing with us." Over the next few days, David continued gathering evidence, working late into the night, reaching out to contacts from his CIA days. Through his connections, he managed to gain access to police records that revealed even more about Kyle's history of misconduct. His reputation was far worse than David had initially suspected. Kyle had left a trail of victims behind him, people who had been intimidated, harassed, or worse, but who had been too afraid to speak up. David knew that this information, combined with the community's formal complaint, would be enough to put significant pressure on the police department to take action. The town's support grew, and soon, Harrison's story reached the local press. Reporters began showing up, asking questions and digging into Kyle's past. Under the spotlight, the police department could no longer ignore the issue. The chief of police, a decent man who had always prided himself on maintaining peace in the community, was now forced to address the matter publicly. In a meeting with the townspeople, he acknowledged the complaints, promising a full investigation into Officer Kyle's behavior. But David knew better than to trust words alone. He knew that it would take more than promises to root out someone as deeply entrenched as Kyle. David had one last move to play, a calculated, strategic move that would ensure Kyle faced the consequences of his actions. As David prepared for the next phase of his plan, he felt a calm, steely resolve settle within him. He was ready to use every skill, every resource, and every bit of his past experience to protect the community he had come to love. The town of Harrison had given him and Jane a fresh start, a place to build their lives, and now it was his turn to give back, to ensure that the shadows that threatened this peaceful place would be cast out, once and for all. And as the people of Harrison stood united, David knew that no matter what happened next, they would not be standing alone. The awakening of Harrison's spirit. In the days that followed the town meeting, Harrison was transformed. What began as a single complaint by a few residents quickly grew into a unified force. People from every corner of the town began to speak up, recounting their experiences and calling for justice. It was as if a sleeping spirit had been awakened within the community, and they would no longer tolerate the presence of a man who had abused his power. The morning after the police chief's public promise of an investigation, David went out for a walk, his mind sharp and focused. The people he encountered greeted him with respect, a few even stopping to shake his hand or nod with appreciation. The town understood that while many voices had contributed to the effort, it was David's courage and his refusal to back down that had given others the strength to speak up. David returned home to find Jane sitting in the living room, sipping tea and reading a book. She looked up as he entered, her expression warm, but tinged with lingering unease. He could see the strain in her eyes, a reminder of the fear that still haunted her since the encounter with Kyle. Although the town had shown its support, and the police chief had made assurances, David knew that until Kyle was truly dealt with, Jane wouldn't be able to fully relax. "I talked to the neighbors this morning," he told her, sitting down beside her. "Everyone's on board. They're ready to see this through." Jane reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his with a sense of comfort. "I'm proud of you, David," she said softly. "I know this isn't easy for you." David looked into her eyes, finding strength in her gaze. "I'll do whatever it takes, Jane. This town deserves to be safe, and you and our child deserve peace." He gently placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the faint movement beneath his palm, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. "But we have to be careful. Kyle won't go down without a fight." Jane nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. Kyle wasn't the type to simply accept defeat, especially not from a community he'd looked down upon from the moment he'd arrived. They both knew that as the investigation moved forward, Kyle would feel the walls closing in, and that made him dangerous. As the days passed, Harrison became a town under scrutiny. Journalists from neighboring cities began to visit, curious about the case that had stirred so much attention in this quiet community. Local businesses displayed signs of support, with posters calling for justice for Jane and anyone else who had suffered under Kyle's actions. It was as if Harrison itself had become a fortress, its people united and resolute. Despite the support, David knew they still needed something more, a way to make sure that Kyle couldn't evade consequences as he had in the past. With his experience and intelligence, David understood that gathering information alone wasn't enough. It needed to be strategically leveraged. Kyle was well practiced at manipulating the system, and even with the town united, there were still forces that could protect him from accountability. David decided it was time to call in one more favor, this time from an old contact who specialized in investigative journalism. Years ago, during his time with the CIA, David had worked with a woman named Sarah Miller, a seasoned reporter known for her dogged pursuit of justice. She had exposed corruption in government agencies and brought down public figures who thought themselves untouchable. He knew that if anyone could shine a spotlight on Kyle's actions in a way that would be impossible to ignore, it was Sarah. The phone call was brief, but Sarah's interest was immediate. "You've got my attention, David," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "I'll be there by tomorrow morning. I want to hear everything." True to her word, Sarah arrived the next day, her presence adding a new level of intensity to the town's fight. She spent hours interviewing residents, collecting stories and documents, and building a case that went beyond Kyle's behavior in Harrison. The more she dug, the clearer it became that Kyle's abusive actions were part of a broader pattern of misconduct that had gone unchecked for years. Sarah's journalistic instincts were sharp, and she saw the bigger picture, a story that would shake not only Harrison, but potentially expose the failures of the entire system that had allowed Kyle to continue in his position. Jane watched Sarah work with admiration and a sense of relief. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that this nightmare would come to an end. The sense of community around her, the resilience of her neighbors, and now the involvement of a respected journalist, it all felt like a shield against the darkness that Kyle had brought into their lives. Sarah's dedication to justice reminded Jane of David's own past, the man he had been before they came to Harrison, and it gave her reassurance that they would overcome this together. One evening, Sarah invited David and Jane to meet with her at a local diner, where she shared her findings. Her investigation had revealed a network of complicity that stretched across several towns. Kyle had been protected by a series of powerful connections, individuals who had quietly transferred him from one department to another, avoiding public scrutiny and covering up his actions. "This isn't just about Kyle," Sarah explained, her voice low but intense. "It's about a system that's allowed people like him to operate without accountability. But this time, We're going to change that. David nodded, his expression resolute. So what's the plan? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sharp. I'm publishing the story tomorrow morning, along with every document, every interview, every piece of evidence we've gathered. But we need to be prepared for the backlash. Kyle won't take this quietly, and neither will the people protecting him. They'll try to discredit us, to intimidate us. David's face remained calm, but his hand tightened around Jane's. Let them try. I've dealt with worse. The next morning, as promised, Sarah's article was published. It wasn't just a local piece. It was a bombshell, an expose that detailed Kyle's abuses of power and the corruption that had shielded him. The story quickly went viral, spreading across social media and drawing national attention. News outlets picked up the story, and Harrison found itself thrust into the spotlight. Within hours, the police department issued a statement promising a full investigation, but David knew this wasn't enough. He had seen the system protect people like Kyle before, and he knew they needed to keep up the pressure. The town's unity and the media coverage were their strongest weapons, and he was determined to use them. As the story gained traction, Kyle's reaction was predictable. He became erratic, lashing out at colleagues, showing up at the homes of those who had spoken out against him, attempting to intimidate them into silence. The police department's chief had no choice but to place him on administrative leave, but David knew that wouldn't stop him. If anything, it made Kyle more dangerous. He was a man cornered, and David could sense the simmering rage in him, a desperate need to reclaim his control. That evening, David decided to take precautions. He set up a series of security measures around his home, installing cameras and reinforcing the locks. He knew that if Kyle decided to retaliate, he would go after those who had spoken out. David wasn't taking any chances, not with Jane's safety on the line. The following night, David stayed up late, watching the surveillance feed. The house was quiet, Jane sleeping peacefully in the next room. The town, too, seemed calm under the moonlight, but David's instincts told him that something was coming. And he was right. Just after midnight, a car pulled up outside his home. David recognized the vehicle instantly. It was Kyle's. He watched as Kyle stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. The man's face was contorted with anger, his jaw clenched as he approached the house. David's pulse quickened, but his training kept him calm. He waited, watching as Kyle moved toward the front door, his hand reaching for something inside his jacket. David couldn't see what it was, but he didn't need to. He stood, moving quietly to the door and positioning himself in the shadows. He was prepared for this, every sense on high alert. Just as Kyle reached the front steps, David opened the door, stepping out to face him. The two men locked eyes, a silent exchange of defiance and rage. "Kyle," David said, his voice calm yet firm. "You're trespassing." Kyle's expression twisted into a sneer. "You think you're going to ruin my life?" He spat. "You don't know who you're dealing with." David held his ground, his gaze steady. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and so does the rest of the country." For a moment, Kyle seemed taken aback, but his anger quickly returned, his hand twitching toward his jacket. David's reflexes kicked in, his stance shifting slightly as he prepared for any movement. "You've hurt enough people, Kyle. This ends now. You're not above the law." Kyle's face contorted with rage, and he took a step closer, his hand inching toward the weapon concealed inside his jacket. But before he could react, David's training took over. With a swift, controlled movement, he disarmed Kyle, pinning him against the porch rail. The strength and precision of his actions left Kyle stunned, his bravado crumbling in the face of David's unwavering resolve. "You're done," David said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You may have gotten away with this before, but not here. Not anymore." As David held him there, the headlights of an approaching car illuminated the driveway. It was Sarah, along with two officers who had come to formally arrest Kyle. With Sarah's story, the public outcry, and the collective voice of Harrison, There was no longer any protection for Kyle. His time had run out. The officers led Kyle away, his face a mask of fury and defeat. David watched as they drove off, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The fight was finally over, and the town of Harrison had reclaimed its peace. As he stepped back inside, David found Jane waiting in the hallway, her face lit with a mixture of relief and pride. She embraced him, and for the first time since that fateful day, she felt safe. Together, they knew that they had faced the darkness and come out stronger. Harrison was no longer a town ruled by fear. It was a town united by resilience, and its people had proven that they would stand together against injustice. And as David and Jane looked out at their peaceful home, they knew they had forged a legacy of courage that would protect their family and their community for generations to come. The healing of Harrison. With Officer Kyle finally arrested and taken into custody, Harrison was left with the aftershocks of the ordeal. Though the threat was removed, the experience had left its mark on the town. In the weeks that followed, there was a palpable tension as the community navigated the emotions stirred by the confrontation and by the exposure of the corruption that had allowed someone like Kyle to remain in a position of authority for so long. David and Jane felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Their lives had been irreversibly altered by this experience, and while they were grateful for the support they had received from the town, they knew that the road to full healing was just beginning. The night of Kyle's arrest lingered in David's mind like a distant storm cloud. He replayed the moment he had confronted Kyle on his front steps, the tension and anger pulsing between them. It was a scene from a life he had tried to leave behind, a reminder of the man he had once been and the lengths he was willing to go to protect his family. But as the days passed, he began to question the cost of that moment. Would he be able to move forward, to fully let go of the part of himself that had resurfaced to fight this battle? Jane, too, felt the strain of the past weeks, though in her heart she found herself inspired by the resilience of their community. Harrison had shown an incredible strength in the face of adversity, and it gave her hope for the future. Yet, she was also haunted by the memories of that day with Kyle, of the vulnerability she had felt. Despite the arrest and the justice that seemed to be unfolding, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that this experience had changed her, had made her more cautious, more aware of the fragility of the world she had once believed was safe. In the days that followed, the town gathered often, holding small meetings and informal discussions to process what had happened. Harrison had become a different place in the wake of Kyle's arrest, and its people were trying to understand how to move forward. Jane was invited to speak at several of these gatherings, where she shared her story once more. Each time, her voice grew stronger, and as she spoke, she felt a sense of release, as though she were shedding the weight of the fear she had carried since that fateful encounter. David stood beside her during each meeting, supporting her, and in many ways, finding his own healing in the community's shared resilience. One evening, as they walked home from a particularly emotional meeting, David took Jane's hand, their fingers interlaced as they strolled down the quiet streets. "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" Jane asked softly, looking up at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. David thought for a moment, gazing down at her, and then out at the darkened houses lining the street. "I think, maybe not the same as before," he replied, his voice contemplative, "but maybe something even stronger. Harrison's different now, but maybe that's a good thing. People are more aware, more protective of each other. I think we're building something new, a new kind of safety." Jane nodded, comforted by his words. She had always admired David's ability to see the possibilities in any situation, even those that seemed hopeless. He was her anchor, and she knew that with him by her side, they would find a way to rebuild their sense of peace. Over the next few weeks, the town rallied around their sense of newfound unity. They organized a town hall meeting where residents shared their ideas for ways to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Suggestions ranged from establishing a community oversight committee for the police department to organizing neighborhood safety patrols. Each proposal was met with enthusiasm, and soon, Harrison was buzzing with activity as people poured their energy into creating a safer, more inclusive environment. David, with his background in security and intelligence, was often asked to lead discussions on safety and trust. Though he was initially hesitant to step into such a public role, he recognized that his experiences, both from his past and from his recent confrontation with Kyle, could offer valuable insights to the community. He agreed to work with the newly established committee, focusing on practical strategies that could help protect the town from future threats. One afternoon, as David sat with a small group in the community center, brainstorming ideas for the oversight committee, he noticed something remarkable. People who might never have crossed paths before, who had once lived quietly in their separate corners of Harrison, were now united, working together toward a common goal. Teachers, store owners, retirees, and young adults, all were contributing ideas, sharing experiences, and finding common ground. It was a transformation he hadn't expected, a reminder of the strength that lay in solidarity. But even as Harrison moved forward, a shadow lingered in the form of a pending trial. Kyle's lawyers had mounted an aggressive defense, portraying him as a misunderstood officer who had merely been misinterpreted by the community. The argument stirred frustration within the town, especially for Jane, who found herself reliving the trauma every time she heard the claims that Kyle's actions had been misunderstood. David, too, felt a familiar anger simmering each time he heard of Kyle's attempts to evade accountability. But he knew he couldn't let that anger control him. He focused instead on supporting Jane, helping her navigate the challenges of the upcoming trial. He attended every court date, standing by her side as they listened to the legal proceedings, and he encouraged the townspeople to attend as well, to show that the community would not be silenced. In the weeks leading up to the trial, David was visited by Sarah Miller, the journalist whose investigation had been instrumental in Kyle's arrest. She had come to check on the couple and to document the ongoing effects of the incident on the town. Sarah was impressed by the changes she saw in Harrison, by the committees, the solidarity, and the resilience of the people. "It's rare to see a town come together like this," she remarked as she sat in their living room, a notebook resting on her knee. "Usually, fear drives people apart. But here, it's different." David nodded, glancing at Jane with a soft smile. "Harrison isn't just a town to us. It's a community, a family. When we were in trouble, everyone rallied behind us. We're trying to return that strength, to make sure that no one here ever has to feel the way Jane did that day." Jane, sitting beside him, placed her hand on his arm, a gesture filled with quiet gratitude. "It's like the town's spirit has been rekindled," she added. "We're more aware of each other now. We look out for each other in ways we didn't before." As Sarah took notes, Jane felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had been through so much, had faced her fears and found strength she didn't know she possessed. And now she wanted to use that strength to make a difference. Inspired by the community's support and the resilience they had shown, she began considering ways to be more involved, to contribute to the growth and healing of Harrison. After Sarah left, Jane shared her thoughts with David. "I've been thinking," she began tentatively. "I want to help people who might be going through something similar. Maybe start a support group or a community initiative, something that would let others know they're not alone." David looked at her with admiration, a smile spreading across his face. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Jane. You've shown incredible courage. I'm sure there are others who would benefit from your support." Buoyed by David's encouragement, Jane reached out to the community leaders, proposing her idea for a support network for residents who had faced discrimination, harassment, or violence. The idea was met with overwhelming support, and soon she was organizing meetings, bringing people together to share their stories and find solace in each other's experiences. The group, which she named Voices of Harrison, became a place of healing, a safe space where people could find understanding and solidarity. Through Voices of Harrison, Jane met others who had experienced moments of fear and vulnerability, people who had once felt isolated in their struggles. Together, They shared stories, held workshops, and organized events aimed at educating the town on empathy, respect, and the importance of standing up against injustice. What had once been a painful memory was now transforming into a source of strength, both for Jane and for the entire community. Meanwhile, David continued his work with the town's safety committee, using his background to develop a series of programs and workshops that empowered residents to look out for one another. He trained volunteers on situational awareness, conflict resolution, and other skills that could help prevent future incidents. Through his efforts, Harrison became not only a safer place, but also a more connected one. The trial finally arrived, and the courtroom was packed with Harrison's residents. Kyle's defense faltered under the weight of the evidence, and the testimonies from the townspeople painted a clear picture of the harm he had caused. Jane's voice, steady and unwavering as she recounted her experience, became a turning point in the proceedings. By the end of the trial, Kyle was convicted, his years of evading justice brought to an undeniable end. As the verdict was announced, Jane felt a rush of relief, an unburdening of the fear she had carried since that day. David's arm around her shoulders was a reminder of the journey they had endured together, and the applause from the townspeople affirmed that they were not alone. When they left the courthouse, a crowd awaited them outside, cheering and celebrating the victory not just for Jane, but for Harrison. The town had faced its darkest moment and emerged stronger, its spirit resilient and whole. Jane and David stood in the middle of the gathering, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and strangers who had become allies. They were no longer just a couple who had experienced hardship. They were a part of something larger, something that would continue to grow and inspire. In the months that followed, Voices of Harrison continued to flourish, its influence spreading beyond the town's borders. People from neighboring communities came to learn from Harrison's example, inspired by the unity and strength that had risen from tragedy. Jane and David became pillars of their town, not as victims but as advocates for change, guiding Harrison into a new era of compassion, vigilance, and justice. Through it all, David and Jane found themselves, and each other, anew. Their journey had tested them, but it had also reaffirmed their love, their resilience, and their commitment to each other and to the community they called home. Harrison had been transformed, and so had they. And as they looked to the future, they knew that they were not alone. They had an entire town standing with them, ready to protect, to heal, and to carry forward the spirit of unity they had fought so hard to build. A new dawn for Harrison. As spring settled over Harrison, a renewed sense of purpose filled the town. The community had weathered a storm that had shaken its foundations, but in the process, it had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. For Jane and David, life was finally beginning to feel peaceful again, but it was a different kind of peace, a peace forged through struggle, empathy, and a profound bond with the people around them. Voices of Harrison continued to thrive, evolving into a powerful force for positive change. The group became a symbol of resilience, with Jane at its heart, guiding its mission and reminding people of the strength they all held. She organized regular meetings, support circles, and outreach programs that brought in speakers from all over the state. Community members who had once been strangers now met weekly, sharing stories, learning, and finding ways to create lasting change. Harrison's local library even dedicated a special room for Voices of Harrison meetings, turning it into a safe haven for anyone who needed a place to feel seen and heard. Through this work, Jane's own healing continued. Every story shared, every hand held in solidarity, reminded her that she was not alone, that none of them were. The small but powerful group had grown beyond anything Jane had expected. People from neighboring towns traveled to Harrison just to attend the gatherings. Some came to listen, some to share their experiences, and others simply to be in a space where understanding and compassion were paramount. David continued to support Jane's efforts, but he was also immersed in his own work with the community's safety committee. Under his leadership, the committee had implemented new policies aimed at creating transparency and accountability within Harrison's police department. Officers now attended regular workshops on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and conflict resolution. David believed in the importance of building bridges, and he saw these programs as an opportunity to foster a stronger relationship between law enforcement and the community. One afternoon, David was approached by Chief Roberts, the head of Harrison's police department. Chief Roberts had been deeply shaken by the events surrounding Kyle's arrest, and since then, he had made a concerted effort to rebuild trust within the community. "David, I want to thank you for everything you've done," Chief Roberts said, his tone sincere. "Your guidance, your commitment, it's made all the difference. I can see a real change happening, and I owe a lot of that to you and Jane." David nodded, appreciating the chief's words but understanding that their journey was far from over. "We all have a role to play, Chief," he replied. "It's about creating a culture of trust, accountability, and respect. That's the only way forward." Inspired by David's leadership, Chief Roberts proposed the idea of a community day, where residents could meet with local officers in a friendly, informal setting. The event would include a series of discussions, open Q&A sessions, and collaborative activities aimed at bridging the gap between the community and its law enforcement. David agreed to help organize the event, viewing it as an opportunity to further solidify the bond between Harrison's residents and the people sworn to protect them. The planning for Community Day took several weeks. Jane joined in, helping to arrange booths for local businesses and coordinating with volunteers who were eager to lend a hand. Voices of Harrison had a dedicated booth where members handed out information about their programs and invited visitors to share their own stories. Jane felt a surge of pride as she watched her community come together, united in purpose and in hope. When the day finally arrived, the town square was transformed into a vibrant scene of laughter, conversation, and celebration. Colorful tents and booths lined the streets, local musicians played cheerful tunes, and children ran about with painted faces, their laughter filling the air. For a town that had once been gripped by fear, the sight was nothing short of a triumph. It was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together to reclaim their peace and safety. At the Voices of Harrison booth, Jane welcomed a steady stream of visitors. She shared her story with anyone who asked, each time feeling a little lighter, a little more free. She knew her tale was no longer a burden. It was now a source of strength, a reminder of resilience, and an invitation for others to find courage within themselves. As Jane stood by the booth, a young woman approached her. She appeared nervous, her hands fidgeting, her eyes downcast. Jane recognized that look immediately, the look of someone carrying a heavy burden. "Hi," the woman said softly, glancing up at Jane. "My name is Leela. I heard about what happened to you, and the work you're doing here. I was hoping to talk, maybe share a little." Jane smiled warmly, her heart filling with empathy. She gestured to a pair of chairs nearby. "Of course, Leela. I'm here to listen." As they sat down, Leela opened up about her own experiences, recounting moments when she, too, had felt marginalized and mistreated. Her voice trembled, but Jane listened intently, offering words of comfort and understanding. It was moments like these that made every struggle, every sleepless night, worth it. When Leela finished, she looked at Jane with a newfound light in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "It feels freeing to finally talk about this with someone who understands." Jane placed a gentle hand on Leela's shoulder. "You're not alone, Leela. None of us are. That's why we're here." Meanwhile, across the square, David watched as residents mingled with officers, sharing conversations and laughter. The atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming, and for the first time in a long time, David felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. This was the Harrison he had always hoped for, a place where trust was mutual, where people felt safe, and where unity triumphed over division. As he turned to look at Jane, he saw her listening to Leela, her face full of compassion and understanding. Watching her in that moment, David felt a renewed sense of admiration. Jane had transformed her pain into something beautiful, something that touched the lives of others and strengthened the community. She was his anchor, his inspiration, and he knew that together they could face anything. The event continued well into the evening, with a final ceremony where Chief Roberts thanked everyone for their support and dedication. Standing under the glowing lights strung across the town square, he acknowledged the journey they had all been through. "I know that what happened here will stay with us for a long time," Chief Roberts said, his voice strong yet reflective. "But from that darkness, we have found new strength, new bonds, and new hope. I want to thank each and every one of you, especially Jane and David, for showing us what it means to stand together, to fight for what's right, and to build a future based on trust and respect." The crowd erupted into applause, and as Jane and David stood side by side, surrounded by the love and gratitude of their community, they felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This journey had not been easy, and there had been moments of doubt and despair. But through it all, they had discovered a new purpose, a new vision for the town they loved. As the crowd began to disperse, Jane and David lingered, taking in the scene around them. The glow of the lights, the soft hum of laughter and conversation, the sight of neighbors embracing. It was a vision of the town they had dreamed of, a place where everyone looked out for each other, where differences were respected, and where no one had to face fear alone. They walked home in silence, hand in hand, the cool night air carrying with it a sense of calm. As they reached their doorstep, David paused, turning to Jane with a look of deep gratitude. "We did it," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We really did it." Jane smiled, her eyes glistening. "No," she replied, her voice gentle. "We all did it. Harrison did it." In the months that followed, life in Harrison returned to a new normal. Voices of Harrison became a permanent fixture in the town, offering support, education, and advocacy for anyone in need. Jane's initiative inspired others, and soon, neighboring towns began to form their own support networks, following Harrison's lead. What had once been a small, quiet town now held a reputation as a beacon of resilience and unity. David continued his work with the Safety Committee, helping other towns and cities implement similar programs for community police relations. His experience, combined with the wisdom he had gained through the journey in Harrison, became a resource for others who wanted to create safe, united communities. And as for Jane and David, they welcomed their child into a world that was brighter, kinder, and safer. Their baby was a symbol of hope, a testament to the strength of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of a family that had endured darkness and emerged into the light. On the first anniversary of Community Day, Harrison gathered once again in the town square. The atmosphere was celebratory, filled with laughter and joy. Jane and David, now parents, watched as their child toddled around, greeted by familiar faces and surrounded by warmth and love. Harrison had become more than a place to live. It was a true home, a home that had been shaped by the strength of its people, by their willingness to stand together, and by their commitment to a future where everyone could feel safe, valued, and loved. As the sun set over Harrison, casting a golden glow over the town, Jane and David held each other close, watching as their child played in the soft, fading light. They knew that the journey had not been easy, but they also knew that they had built something lasting, something that would carry on for generations to come. In the quiet beauty of that moment, they understood that Harrison's legacy would not be defined by its struggles, but by its triumphs. The town had been reborn, its spirit stronger than ever, and together they would continue to protect and nurture it, now and always.